Welcome back to Maba reopening after the winter retreat of 3 months. I'm here talking today about Huáyán Buddhism. I had given a talk about this subject, part one, right before the winter retreat began. And if you're interested in learning about that, it's uploaded on the Maba website under media, I think, and in YouTube. So you're welcome to watch that if you like. It's the beginning introduction to Huáyán and its relationship to interdependent origination. But today I'm going to continue my talk. If you didn't get to see the first one, it's okay. Review some of the basic principles. And then next week, I will be doing part three, and then I won't be talking about Huáyán until a little bit. So when we speak about Huáyán Buddhism, flower ornament sutra or flower adornment sutra, the word in Sanskrit, Avatamsaka, is actually a word that means like a garland or necklace that adorns something. That, like I think if you go to Hawaii, they put a lei on you, to welcome you. So this is maybe a way of welcoming us into a higher level understanding of the Buddhist teachings. So according to different schools, they have a different list of the important Mahayana sutras. And depending upon the school, they always put the highest levels. That's the most important one. And would be no surprise that the Huáyán School, Huáyán Zong, put the Huáyán Sutra as the most important. It's a translation of the Avatamsaka Sutra, which has been translated a few times into English in different formats. The original translation by Buddha Bhadra took 40 of, it's a very large text, took 40 of the maybe 60 fascicles and translated that in from the Sanskrit to the Chinese. And then later it was translated into the full text from Sanskrit into Chinese, the 80 fascicles. And that was done by a group of translators. I'll tell a little bit about that in a bit. But the translation into English started with Thomas Cleary, who's a very famous translator. And this text, as you can see how large the text is, this text had 1,640 pages. Wow. And this is not all of it. He left parts of it out. And at the City of 10,000 Buddhas, the Buddhist Text Translation Society, Venerable Master Xiǎnkuān, she translated maybe 3/4 of the chapters into English. And then Master Hongshur, who is living in Australia now, but also gives a podcast, well, actually a talk every Friday night, is now translating, his group is translating some of the other chapters. But the major translation of the text was released just a few years ago by Venerable Dharma Mitra. And this text has 2,480 pages. or as we say, a good long weekend of reading. So this is a mammoth work. This work contains the core of the 52 stages of the Bodhisattva. This is a training, step-by-step training, 52 stages, and 42 of those stages are outlined in the Avatamsaka. The first 10 stages, we call the 10 stages of trust or 10 stages of faith. That's contained in some other texts. So that's contained in the Huáyán Sutra, the Sutra for Humane Kings, and the Brahmanet Sutra, Fascicule 1. Fascicule 2 has the 58 vows of the Bodhisattva. And there's a little bit of it in one chapter of the Avatamsaka Sutra. These first three, two of them have never been translated into English. The third one, yes, translated by Chuck Mueller and his another colleague. So the Huáyán Jing actually, as I said, contains the 42 stages. We'll say 40 for right now because the 2 additional stages are embedded in some other teachings in a little bit more elaborate way. So these 40 stages are in 4 chapters and these chapters are approximately all together, maybe, well, 2 of the chapters are very long and 2 of the chapters are much shorter. But we can say that the essence of the teaching for the Bodhisattva stages is probably only 25 pages long. So if you really want to understand the stages, then you really have to study those 25 essential pages. So there's been no commentary in English on this text. With a little caveat in there, and Master Xiǎnkuān did give a commentary, but it's from a monastic point of view with maybe just a restating of some of the text, and he doesn't go through the 40 stages in much detail. And there's a short kind of synopsis. It's given by Venerable Dharma Mitra. But in Chinese, there are a huge number of commentaries on this text because of how important it is. So why is Huáyán Buddhism so interesting? What is it about Huáyán Buddhism that makes it so important? Because in a way, it gives the philosophical foundation for understanding how interdependent origination fits into our daily lives and how we can apply this teaching of interdependent origination to our meditation practice as well as to our interactions with other people, and how this can help us to decrease our suffering and reach liberation. To review, interdependent origination is one of the major teachings that the Buddha gave. And depending on how you want to list them, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, which is part of that, the five aggregates, and interdependent origination. These are the central themes of the Buddhist teachings. So this is one of those major important components. So understanding what that means is something that really was the essence of the turning of the wheel, second turning of the wheel, that was initiated by Nagarjuna in the 1st century, where Buddhism, the original Buddhism that had been followed by his disciples, and then for hundreds of years afterwards, and then codified into what eventually became what we know as Theravada Buddhism. This was at that time, Buddhism around the 1st century had fallen into some decay. There were monks that were going into the forest and they weren't interacting with people. And there were monks that were just writing books and they weren't interacting with the people. And so Buddhism went into a latent phase. And this was brought out of that phase by Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka Buddhism that then reinitiated and reinvigorated Buddhism. And he did that using an understanding of interdependent origination or dependent origination, a dependent arising that's put in different terms. So this had actually been in effect for quite some time, and there was this interest in Madhyamaka, the middle way that Nagarjuna had developed, and then that was brought to China. And then there was this other major branch of Buddhism at that time, another Mahayana greater vehicle in the form of Yogacara that had emerged, talking about the practice of meditation, different stages, cultivation. And this came to a head in the early 7th century when Xuanzang returned from his pilgrimage to India and put together this very important work called the Changwei Shalang, which is the doctrine of mere consciousness or consciousness only. And at the same time, there was this emergence of many interest in a lot of the Mahayana sutras, the Lotus Sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra, etc. And then this then became an interest in Huáyán Sutra as well. So one of the people who was very involved in this understanding, I'm giving you a history lesson here, was Master Dushan, who around 600, you might say, he was his involvement in this study of the Huáyán Jing, the flower ornament or adornment sutra, really began to take root in Buddhist culture. There was a mountain range just south of the capital. At that time, the capital called Chang'an, which is now Xi'an. That's where the terracotta warriors are. You should go visit. Just so about 50 miles south of that, there's a mountain range, Zhongnanshan. So this mountain range had many monasteries that have been built there over the years. And that's where Master Dushan started teaching. And he started teaching the Huáyán Jing. And he needed a new vocabulary, a new way of being able to help people understand how to look at phenomenon in a different way, how to look at emptiness in a different way, because these were the terms that were being discussed in all of the other schools, including Chan Buddhism. How do we understand phenomenon? How do we understand what's called emptiness? What does this have to do with our practice? And so he taught this to his disciple, Master Huáyán came afterwards, and then Master Fazan, and so on. There were 5 great lineage masters, and then the Huáyán School was wiped out. So for about 250 years, which is a long time, this school was thriving. It was one of the most important schools in northern China. In southern China, we have the Chan School beginning to develop and emerging as a major school. And the northern school was held together by Huáyán. The difficulty arose with the fact that Huáyán Buddhism became a favorite form of understanding and teaching Buddhism for the rulers of China, who the capital was in Chang'an, and then in Huáyán, which is to the east. Actually, 2 capitals. It's kind of interesting why it is that there were 2 capitals. But if I keep digressing, I'll never get anywhere. But it's just an interesting story. Empress Wu, you may have heard of her. She's the only teacher, only emperor female. And she was quite powerful. She assumed the throne behind the scenes when her husband became ill, was no longer able, he was never really very strong, physically, or even as an emperor. She was the force behind that. She had actually been a concubine of the father of Huáyán. Taizhan was the emperor before that. She was a concubine. Now, Taizhan was not particularly interested in her. But after he died, the usual thing that would happen is that all the concubines of the former emperor, they were forced to go into a monastery, become a monastic, whether they wanted to or not. That was the style, that was the idea. So she was put into a novice, became a novice monastic, and she was lighting incense one day to the deceased Emperor Taizong, and she met his son at the altar, and he became intrigued with her. She left the monastery and became a concubine for him. This was before women's liberation. But she asserted herself and became very strong in an understanding of the political realm and how to maintain power. How do you maintain power when there are people who are jealous of you, envious, and trying to manipulate things so that they would be in a position of power and you are not in a position of power? How do you solve that problem? Well, you poison them, you exile them, you force them to commit suicide. And so, although Empress Wu was very interested in Buddhism, she ended up getting rid of all of her adversaries, including probably killing all 3 of her children. at least two of them. But she was very interested in Buddhism. And particularly Master Fazan was her teacher. So the problem is that if you're very close to politics and politics change, difficulties will arise. And so because Buddhism intertwined itself with the politics, eventually there was an emperor years later who disliked Buddhism. He was Emperor Di, and he decided to purge China of Buddhism. And so the Huáyán School, very close to the capital, was wiped out for the most part. So here we have a little map you can see. Let's see. Yeah, I think I have it. So there were other forces during this 250 years. There were some other people who were involved in Huáyán School. One was a Korean monk, his name Lee Sang. I talked about him maybe a year or two ago. He had this amazing map, a diagram called the Ocean Seal Diagram, which we can use as a teaching tool, which looks like a maze with Chinese characters in it. And then there was another person of great interest, his name Li Tongchuan. Li Tongchuan, he was a layperson who wrote a very important commentary on the Huáyán Jing. Lots of interesting folks. So Master Dushan, he was the first one, set up this monastery on the mountain for teaching. He's called the first lineage master of the school. So Shikshananda is the person who did who led the group to do the translation. I should say a little bit about this translation group that formed around 695, 697, somewhere around in there. And there was a particular monk who was jealous of Fazan, the lineage master. And so he spread a rumor about Master Fazan, that Master Fazan had disparaged the Buddha, called the Buddha a low-level bodhisattva. And this information spread throughout the Buddhist community. Fazan kept silent. He didn't defend himself. He didn't get angry. He wasn't upset. He just stayed silent. The rumor got all the way up to Empress Wu, lots of pressure on her. What are you going to do about what Master Fazan said? So she banished him, exiled him to southern China, to a remote area. But his exile didn't last very long because the translation group couldn't translate the last parts of the Huáyán Jing. So they had to send for him, come back, help us translate. We can't do it. So he came out of exile, and he never said a word about the person who disparaged him, never complained, never made a big deal about it. So what did Master Dushan say? have just a few more minutes to go into this. Master Dushan, he wanted to explain phenomenon and emptiness in a new way. So he used new terms. For phenomenon, instead of using the usual term fa, dharmas, he used the term shi. And instead of using the word for emptiness, kong, he used the word li. So he formed a philosophy on shi and li, looking at things from a different point of view. Using the different words, people had to like, oh, what does this mean? Because if you use the old words, they would say, oh, I know what that means. We use different terms. So there's a lot of inner understanding of Chinese words and what they meant. And I think that I will skip over that because if anybody is interested in understanding how all of that fits together in the intricacies of that, there is now a text that talks about all of those kinds of elements and also about the 10 stages of trust that have not been commented on in English. So we have the first English commentary on the 10 stages of trust. The person who wrote this is very near and dear to me, at least in this lifetime. And we have copies available here. And all of the proceeds go to the monastery. So what did Dushan have to say? He said that we have a phenomenon, we call it in the Dharma realm. This is the realm that includes all of the realms. So all phenomenon are reified and subject to this duality. But in fact, it's all an illusion. And then he talks about how there is this one principle of emptiness that pervades everything. And that principle and phenomenon, they exist, they are interconnected with each other. They interfuse with each other, but without obstruction. And even phenomena themselves, this is the real controversial part, the phenomena themselves don't obstruct with each other. They intertwine with each other. So this philosophy, very, very deep to try to understand this. So obviously during this period of time, the time of Buddha and also Dushan and all of this, there was no understanding at all about quantum physics. This was completely unknown to folks. But now, with quantum physics, we have an understanding that everything that around us, all of what we call phenomena, all of this, which is what we call substance, solid, is really made up of molecules. Inside the molecules there are atoms. Inside the atoms there are subatomic particles. And these subatomic particles are jumping in and out of existence at a very rapid rate, just like when you're watching television, the pixels on your digital TV are jumping in and out of existence, and it makes this continuity. So we have this continuity. This jumping in and out of existence is happening at an extremely high rate, much faster than what we can see or experience because our senses are limited. We don't think about this so much, but we think, oh, what we see is reality. But, we know now from, our sense of reality is based on our senses. So if you look at someone, and unless you're Superman or something, you don't see people's inside of their bodies, their bones. You don't have X-ray vision. You have to go to the X-ray machine for that. You want to look at something very small, a microscope, something bigger, you have to use a telescope, something like that. So we have different ways of being able to perceive reality. So our reality has become bigger. They didn't have that back in the day of 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. So we know now that inside of this, there are these subatomic particles. And if you take I've talked about this many times, if you take an atom, maybe a hydrogen atom, and you make it the size of a baseball and you throw it into Busch Stadium, the electron field will fill the entire stadium. It's all empty. Empties. And then every once in a while, you'll see an electron. And if you try to fix the position of the electron, you don't see the position, you only see its momentum. And if you look for the momentum of the electron, you don't find that, you find the position. This is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And then it's what it is. But it's all empty space. So most of what it is that we call substance, 99.999% of that is empty space, and the other 0.001 is jumping in and out of existence. Emptiness. So we know emptiness is the foundation of the substantial world. But we can't operate that way when we're driving our car or when we're walking around. We have to live in what the Guardian called the conventional world. Can't live in the world of emptiness. So the fact that the quantum world and the world of classical Newtonian physics, that they pervade each other without obstruction, we see that all the time. Your quarks are not getting in the way of your bosons. And if they are, we're in trouble. The big issue is that how do this paradox of how there's non-obstruction a phenomenon, because we bump into each other. When I read this first, I tried to walk through the wall. Very painful, unsuccessful. Because there seems to be some kind of obstruction there. But that obstruction, I'll talk about later in another text. Actually, I mention it here. This obstruction is only from the point of view of the fact that we're a carbon-based unit. Carbon-based unit, we connect with the other carbon-based units. I'm a psychotherapist, and I talk with all kinds of people. And I was having a conversation with a little 11-year-old girl who was having a bunch of anxiety about stuff. And we were talking about her school and what she was learning in school. And we got into talking about how there are molecules and atoms and subatomic particles for a moment. And then she looked at me and she said, quite seriously, she said, "Am I real?" Oh. And since her mother was sitting right next to her, I said, yes. So that's a little bit about Huáyán Buddhism, which I'll talk more about in our next week. I hope you can come and we can learn more together about this. We'll have a little discussion in Manjushri Hall after this, and then in the afternoon after lunch, I think we have a little bit more time where we can go into more detail, and if people have questions, I will see if I can help, or maybe you have comments about some of this material as well. I find it very fascinating. So the 10 stages of trust, if I can just say one more word, begins with the aspiration to be of benefit. That's the beginning. I want to be of benefit. So I hope that this little talk is of some benefit. Watch out, don't get too entangled with politics.